Good afternoon, everyone. Special thanks to the DSL people for inviting us here. I also want to give a big shout out to the Deliveroo design team who is watching us in live stream right now. Hi, Rob. We're going to be talking about sort of a journey in building design systems at Deliveroo from scratch, Matt and I. Like was said, I'm a designer. Matt is a designer / engineer. For the sake of this conversation, he's an engineer. And
thanks.
He's one of those unicorns. Yeah. We both work at Deliveroo. For the people who are not familiar with Deliveroo, it's a food company. We work with restaurants and riders to deliver food to people in around, I think, 13 markets now, and in dozens and dozens of cities. The thing that's particular about Deliveroo is that from day one, it had a lot of product areas, and it had to cover a lot of different platforms. So one of the product areas that we have is the one that you probably all know. It's where you order the food, and that has to support all of the platforms. We also have products for riders to pick up the food, to get onboarded into our system. Again, 2 different products there. 2 different products in restaurants, on Android and web, for tablets in restaurants to receive the orders and to manage your sales and how you're performing on Deliveroo. We also have an incredible amount of internal tools. Obviously, these are not these internal tools because they're internal, but you can imagine that there's a lot of dashboards, a lot of data tables, and so on and so forth. So at Deliveroo, the people who interact with UI, who build UI, who design UI, are these people. So the goal of our team, I think, was a little bit different from what design systems teams usually go for. We didn't really want to go for consistency's sake. What we were really interested in, given that we're a company that's growing very fast, developing a lot of features, is to really optimize the speed of design and development. What we've ended up with, essentially right now, is that we have 2 large design systems at Deliveroo. We have one that deals with consumer products, so things that are facing for customers and for riders. And then we have another design system mainly for tools. And these design systems deal with 2 different use cases. One is a lot more about touch interfaces, about being friendly and accessible. And another is more about density and getting things done, utility. The way we have structured it internally, we recently made the switch to Figma. We're pretty happy with it. The thing that's really great about the way Figma organizes its libraries is that it allows you to sort of separate concerns. So we have a global library that deals with all of effectively our tokens. So typography, colors, icons, things of that nature. And then that feeds into all of our other sort of sub-design systems. As I said, consumer is one of them, tool is one of them. Illustrations is also one thing that we try to keep in our design systems because it's inheriting a lot of our tokens, so things like color. I'll go through this very quickly because we've all seen this stuff, right? So this is what our global library looks like. It holds all of our color variables and then breaks that down in how we actually use them in real life. Typography. This is what our illustration library looks like. It's organized by size so that you know what you can use at what size. This is actually a small portion of our consumer library. It holds what you think it would hold, so a lot of components across different platforms. But it also contains things like page templates and larger patterns. This is what again, I understand this is very small, but I could go into the details of this, but it's everything you would think is in there, right? So models, type, patterns, graphs, what have you, right? So this hopefully gives you a little bit of context to the sort of learnings that we've had in building this design system. So the first thing I would say is that if you're thinking about building a design system, you should probably build it only on top of a product that's mature. When we were building our design system, we were in a situation where specifically our consumer products were still shifting around a little bit. And it made building a design system quite hard because effectively you're shooting for a moving target. What we've also found is, actually this was we paid the price for that quite a bit, is that if you're thinking of spinning up a team, you're most likely to succeed if you have at least one designer and one engineer full-time minimum. Given that we had a lot of oversight into all the products at Deliveroo, it was very easy for product managers to sort of pull us into ongoing projects. Hey, you guys know about this. How about you go in there and fix that? That's fine. We don't mind doing that. But what happened was, during those times that we were off of projects, design systems as a service in the company was basically down, right? We couldn't fix all the things out of the components that need to be added regularly. Another thing, which I'm sure most of you know, is that you're effectively competing when you're building a design system with all of the other alternatives. One of the alternatives being, I'll just do it myself. So ideally, using a design system should be 10 times easier than the alternative. Of course, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but hopefully it drives the point home. One of the ways that you make the design system easier than the alternative, and this is something that I think is a bit controversial, is we try to really bias for building documentation straight into the tools that people are using every day. Now, I have no beef with all of these beautiful websites that have documentation and talk in very idealistic terms about their design system. But what we found is that as soon as you start documenting your design system outside of where people actually are, not only are you going to be out of date the day you write documentation, but most likely people are not going to read it. That sort of principle has driven the kinds of tools and the kinds of tricks that we do in the UI kits that we built. So this is one of the reasons why we really like Figma. Figma allows you to document each component, each variable inside of the tool itself. So for instance here, we're looking at teal 20, which is one of our colors. We can document that teal 20 is only used for focus states, for instance. And when developers look at it, they don't care that it's used for focus states. That should be in the designer's domain. They only need to know that it's teal 20. So that separation of concerns is something that we really, really like, and we hope there's more of. The other thing that we do is we try to sort of incorporate hacks and tricks into guiding designers as they use our components into what the right usage for these components is. So for instance, we care a lot about aspect ratios on our cards. Those aspect ratios are built in by default. And if you get into a situation where you try to resize those, at any given point, you give an indication about where you're right and where you're wrong, right? So ideally, usage should be built into the actual assets that you're using. What we found, however, is that design tools, whether you're using Figma or Sketch or XD or whatever, are still widely not mature enough to properly manage, distribute, and document these systems. To give you an example, one of the things that I'm sure most of you use if you're designing for mobile are rows. Okay, rows are pretty dumb, but it's actually the thing that you probably use the most over and over again. And it's also probably the thing that is most complicated, right? You have a bunch of different options, you can mix and match those options. Rules around these can be quite subtle. So what you have to do, which I don't like doing, my designers don't like reading, is to do stuff like this. Hey, on Android, you can use this, not this. Hey, on iOS, you use chevrons, and you use dividers, and you use padding. Who wants to read that? No one. Who wants to apply that? No one. Ideally, we get to a point soon where the tools make that completely built-in. I'm just going to skip that because that's not really interesting.
Solid.
Misjudgment on my part. What we found also is that, and this is probably only works for us, but when we're building a system, removing platform specificity made things a lot more manageable for us. So whenever we could, we sort of collapsed components that do the same thing into just one instance across Android, iOS, mobile web, etc. And sometimes even across desktop as well. However, in situations where you do have to document what are the equivalencies between these platforms, we try to build into the way we build our UI kits. So like in this particular instance, if you're using a bottom sheet on mobile, you're using a modal on desktop. Might be obvious for me, probably not for the people who are using this every day. So kind of making sure that that's well documented is something that we really care about. Ultimately though, as a lot of people have said, component library is not a design system. What you want is a design system. And that comes with documentation, it comes with talking about not just components, but principles, patterns, etc. And in order to make sure that these things are actually pushed through, what we found is that design systems should be built by people with experience. And at first I thought it was authority, but actually I think it's more influence is the best way to say this, right? Not that I have experience or influence, but design systems, I think, should be built by people who are pretty conservative and who are okay with the fact that half of their job is going to be talking to people every day. Now, I don't necessarily do this all the time, but I try to force myself, being not a people person myself, to sit down with people, hey, how's it going? Is there anything I can help you with? Is everything working for you? And I think what we heard earlier about listening to the quiet people is really powerful, because it's the quiet people who will actually tell you, hey, actually, this doesn't work for me. Can you please change it? Yes, we will do it. Let's, yeah. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Matt, cool. And hopefully your mic works as well.
So yeah, as Raph said, I was kind of the engineering half of Deliveroo's UI Info team. So just to quickly give you some context, it kind of mirrors a little bit what design has. We have multiple component browsers or component libraries that you can install. This, for example, is the web internal tools component library. So the thing you're seeing is kind of like our own version of Storybook, which I'll get into in a sec. This would be the equivalent consumer version for the public-facing website. And then we have like a whole array of other things. So like we have like an icon set you can install, for example, that gives you like Android and iOS and React and SVGs, including also an icon font for design tools, and like little microsites. Like this one, for example, is when you are kind of caught outside of the system and you've got an illustration or something, you need to quickly look up a color. You just go to this live website, by the way, which has no auth, and just find out our colors. So that's kind of like the context. So there's like loads of packages and kind of two component browsers to look at things. So I'll kind of start chronologically. So one of the first things I think I learned was that you really have to make sure that design is in good shape before you start on an endeavor to start a design system. I know many people disagree with this because a lot of people will say, well, you have already some UI, you have things already, you could systematize those things. My experience is that if designers are amongst each other inconsistent, there's a natural skepticism from the engineering team and from engineers to standardize on an implementation. The moment your designers are, or as a design team, you're consistently being consistent, it kind of sells itself that you shouldn't re-implement a button every time, or that you shouldn't type hex colors everywhere, that you can just reuse them. So I think that's really important. Once you've got there, I think the next real step is to decide the kind of design system that you need as a team. So when I started with design systems, my kind of mental model was that there's like Bootstrap and then Airbnb, and you're somewhere that's like bad, good, and you kind of have to understand where you are, and like that's absolutely not true, and it's just wrong. You really need to decide, like, as a team and as a product, what you need. So I'll give you an example. If you imagine this component on the left with the read more and the little icon, you could implement that component in React in about 19 different ways, right? So the way you create your component is really important, and you have to decide what you want. So if you look at the top example, it's basically almost no abstraction on top of a normal anchor tag in HTML, right? You have an href, a target, and then you can provide an icon, and you put some stuff in it, and that's the text. Now, if you think about that example, I could do all sorts of things, right? I could have target blank on a non-external link. I could have any random icon. Instead of typing read more, I could put other components in there. I could put a loading spinner in there, and so on and so on. And that's kind of like the end that we chose to go for our internal tools. It's very, it has very kind of low level of abstraction, and is very, very flexible, so you can kind of do a lot with it. On the other end is the bottom example, which is really like rock solid and tightly scoped to just being a link component, right? So you say the link is external, and by default, that component will make it open in a new tab and also set the right icon. So what you've done in the second one is kind of baked in some design decisions that we said, hey, every time we have an external icon, it has a thing. to do these kind of things and to decide this, like, we really found it incredibly helpful to write these things down. So you don't want to be having that conversation when someone opens a pull request for that link button. Like, that is the worst time, and it's demoralizing if you open a pull request that you're immediately like bombarded with these really orthogonal conversations about like principles and what you want. And so principles are really important, and you should totally write them down and agree on them beforehand, and it'll just make every conversation easier to manage. I have many examples of these, but unfortunately don't have the time, so come talk to me later if you want to hear more about the kind of things we have in there. Then, exactly like in design, we don't force anyone to use our component library or design systems, so it has to be easier than any alternative. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of how we do that. Broadly, these all go under the umbrella of thinking of your design system as open source, like internally open source. Like, there are many libraries to pick from, why would they pick you, kind of thing. So the first one, for example, is that we have our own version of Create React App, which if you're making an internal tool, you run Create Deliveroo tool, and you get a website about an npm install later, where the component library already baked in, all the styles coming from CDNs, so it's easy to use, and just you're good to go. So you kind of get it by default. Another example is we religiously write a changelog. It's actually it's a step in the to release. You have to write one, commit it, and open a pull request so that it can be reviewed. And this is so that breaking changes don't mistakenly slip in. It also forces people to think about what they're doing and why they're doing it. Like, it kind of catches these, like, I'm adding a 7th color to the button. You're like, whoa, that reads weird. And also, ultimately, it just builds trust. So that if you're using an app and you're using the component library, you know that you can upgrade on your own schedule. So that's using it. Contributing it, though, it has to be as easy, right? So much like a good open source library that gets a lot of contributors, it has to be easy to use. And there's a lot of cheap things that you can do, I think, that really help this. So these are like some quality of life things, for example, that when you write an example, you automatically get code examples. You don't have to do anything special. Also, when you're writing examples for your components, you can pick the color you want the background to be, and that allows you to quickly test components that only work on certain backgrounds. Another quality of life thing that's equally easy is to give people a way of viewing a component in a full screen view, like truly full screen with no UI around it. So this lets you test, for example, a modal that you have some special responsive behavior, or you need to really be sure that there's nothing else on the DOM besides your component. Then there's the whole documentation side. So at Deliveroo, if you on the left write those prop types for a component, it will automatically generate the documentation on the right. And this is to essentially help good documentation come about by default. And we just use React DocGen for this, so we haven't invented anything. A kind of proof of how good our whole kind of authoring experience is that actually a lot of people have started using our component browser as just a dev environment that they can use within their own web apps. So at Deliveroo, a lot of web apps just have our component browser baked in to just document components of that web app. So this on the left is the only thing you have to write to get the thing on the right, besides obviously the component. Despite all this, there's still a massive problem, which is that often the component strategy of things the component kind of structure is lost by the time it actually gets built, or the other way around. So we really still don't have a good solution to this, and even though Figma does pretty well in showing you the component names, there are still gaps. And it's something we definitely wish we had invested more in to try and solve. The last thing I'll say, and I think this is the most, I think kind of Raph alluded to this already, but doing a cross-platform design system really is really hard unless you have a cross-platform kind of makeup of the team, or at least some experience within the team in every platform. We kind of started with web because it was close to my experience, and it was where all of our internal tools were initially, and we kind of then the other platforms followed along, and it led to a lot of things where for example, engineers didn't feel like they had been involved early on enough, iOS and Android engineers particularly, and it's absolutely true. We made a lot of bad decisions because we started on web. But furthermore than that, there's a whole element around kind of QA. So this is what you think is going on, right? So you've got some components and some kind of principles and ideas and rules that Raph showed, and then you're cool. Then we have an execution per platform. And then for each of those platforms, we have technical documentation on how to use that thing, right? So if I'm an iOS engineer, how do I install it and use it? What's actually happening is that it's all a bit spotty. There are bits missing. Some things are just completely not there. Some things are the same, but not the same, or named slightly differently in ways that will now never be fixed. Yeah. And when you get to this point, when you start realizing this, you kind of think that this is what you kind of want, but you're like, wow, this is really hard to build, right? So like some companies have done this, and kudos, it's hard. It's to essentially have like a single overarching documentation that documents all of the different platforms as kind of just as part of a bigger system. What we really feel the more and more we've done this is that like this is what you actually need. What you actually need is a way of specifying components in a very generic way. What the generic way is could be code, it's quite flexible, doesn't have to be. And then from there, generate iOS, Android web, and also design tool equivalencies. Starting with design is actually inherently kind of flawed because that's the thing you're always thinking back to. And then, obviously, with that comes a very easy way to documentation. We haven't got to this, and we think that this is really, really interesting stuff, and there are slow attempts at trying to get to this, and if you'd like to talk us more about this, or if you're trying this, please come chat to us. Yeah. And lastly, we're going to post this deck online, and I really think it'd be great if you can come and chat to us afterwards and talk to us about this. I think there's a lot in the kind of space of trying to understand how to really hit that cross-platform and also like enveloping of design and engineering in one kind of good way. And yeah, we'll be posting a talk online later. That's it. Thanks. Can we take that?